So just to get started, I want to say, as social scientists committed to understanding the complexities of human societies, it's important to begin by acknowledging the land that which we gather. The University of Toronto operates on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit. The land has been a site of human activity, governance, knowledge exchange, and cultural expression for thousands of years. It remains home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize the enduring presence and resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. As we engage in scholarly inquiry, let us reflect on the responsibilities we carry as researchers, educators, and community members to respect Indigenous knowledge systems, histories, and rights.
Welcome everyone to the Reframing Pain Conference. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to have this day finally arrive. At this particular historical moment, I think it's more important than ever for us to gather together in the work that we do toward equity, toward social justice, and be able to support each other. So PEPPR is the project from which CASPR emanates. So PEPPR has two main objectives. The first is to bring an equity lens into this notion of patient engagement and research, and to really explore both what that does look like and what it could look like. And then the second objective, which relates directly to CASPR, is that we have a mission to advance critical social science approaches in the chronic pain and pain research spaces. We are inter and multidisciplinary. We have anthropology, we have sociology, we have nursing, philosophy, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, psychology, social work. You name it, the disciplines I think are represented through CASPR. So thank you so much everyone for being here, and thank you to all the speakers who've traveled so far to join us today.
Thanks to all of the organizers for this really kind invitation. What a brilliant room. I'm interested in learning and talking with all of you today. My research in general is focused on childhood disability, childhood ethics, and children's rehab. And my interest in pain research in particular grew from the recognition that across my qualitative research with disabled children and youth, regardless of the topic, pain always featured in children's accounts. So today I'm going to argue in favor of disrupting the status quo by bringing a critical lens into our research endeavors, with a view to pointing out the generative value added by going against the grain and challenging ourselves to think otherwise. First, my work is aligned with critical disability scholarship and concerns disabled children. So this is a bit of a focus, not too much actually in this talk, but I hope you'll think along with me and bring your own substantive topics and research interests into the questions I'm asking, and also into these provocations. And also, there is no one right way to talk about disability, but because I align with disability studies scholarship, we argue that disability is produced through discriminatory and ableist social structures, and not something as a deficit that is located within a person. In this relatively brief presentation, by no means will I be able to unpack or even list all of the wide range of concerns and tensions and ethical issues that can be addressed when it comes to bringing a critical lens to pain research. But I'd like to ask some questions to get us started. So first, what do we know? And what do we need to know when it comes to, and again, you'll see my square bracket, in my case, disabled children's pain. And you might finish that sentence in different ways. What is it that's taken for granted? Whose perspectives and experiences are valued and then represented? How are we accounting for the moral experiences of young disabled people who live with pain? And importantly, how can we think otherwise in order to expand understandings of living with pain? Importantly, too, how can we better account for the social and the ways it shapes experiences of pain and approaches to pain management? So to answer these questions, we first need to really disrupt the status quo by challenging assumptions, the ideas, norms, values, and beliefs that come to seem natural, necessary, and right. We rely on assumptions to help us make sense of the world and to find our way. But some of these assumptions are taken for granted ideas that privilege certain social groups while contributing to the marginalization and inequities experienced by others. Let's just briefly consider some of the problems related to trying to surface assumptions. Some assumptions are a problem of immersion, like fish immersed in water. The values, norms, and assumptions that pervade our thinking are invisible to us. Assumptions can also appear unchangeable, as truths or just the way of the world and immutable. But values, beliefs, and norms do change over time. They're not fixed, as this poster shows. Take the decreased prevalence of cigarette smoking as just one very powerful example. Assumptions are also part of what make us make quick judgments, including what we've come to refer to as implicit bias. Consider how changes in the dress and posture of these two men act to elicit different assumptions about who they are and how we might interact with them. So how can critical social sciences and perspectives help us to disrupt and challenge our thinking in relation to pain and pain research? I'm going to introduce very briefly 3 such approaches that I combine in my research with disabled young people: critical disability studies, childhood ethics, and critical rehabilitation studies. So first, a critical disability studies lens, and as I've mentioned, in contrast to biomedical perspectives where disability is positioned as a deficit within individuals, critical disability studies draw on the embodied experiences and perspectives of disabled persons to argue that disability is produced through discriminatory and stigmatizing social relations. So my aims in taking up a critical disability studies lens then are to unpack these taken for granted ideas and concepts about pain and disability, examine socially ingrained values and beliefs, reveal then the socio-political dimensions of disability, pain, childhood and youth, and rehabilitation in order to then reflect on what could be otherwise. This is one of my favorite quotes from some scholars from the UK who do a lot of work around children and disability. And they challenge us to think about disability as having an enduring potential to get us to think differently about the world. And this is one of the ways that I try to work with disability studies in my own research. Moving on again briefly, another critical perspective that I bring to my work can be called, or is called, the emerging field of childhood ethics, which in very short terms is about advancing children's agency. So again, try to break down and rethink assumptions that we have about children, their capability, what they're able to do, and how they can be involved in providing knowledge. There's a preponderance of research that's demonstrated that young people are able to share understandings of what they think is right and good in relation to their experiences of healthcare. Yet, assumptions about children's capacity to understand and to actively reflect on what is at stake, their agency, continue to limit the extent to which children's views, preferences, and wishes are listened to and acted on in medical contexts. Instead, assumptions overrule, like these, that children are incapable, inexperienced, dependent, vulnerable, and in need of protection. Yet critical scholars might argue, and have, regardless of legal debates, lack of competence does not remove the right to express a view. I've listed just one of many publications dealing with this issue, where when children are deemed incompetent or incapable, they tend most often to then be completely excluded from those discussions and decisions about their very own health care. Last, I'd like to introduce an even newer emerging field of study, critical rehabilitation studies, which draws closely on critical disability studies, but as opposed to extracting knowledge from critical disability studies to inform rehab, critical rehabilitation studies aims to do that heavy lifting, involved in thinking critically about the ethics that underpin so much of rehabilitation, and therefore pain-related rehabilitation. In their way, I would suggest that Drs. Walton and Mescouto with me today, whose talks follow, are also researchers whose work aligns with critical rehabilitation studies. A critical rehabilitation studies lens thus suggests alternative areas of inquiry, new ways of producing knowledge, and different ways of examining common issues compared to mainstream rehabilitation practices. For example, questioning the body as machine model that's prevalent in rehab in order to offer new ways for researchers to understand and to respond to their patients' experiences of illness and impairment. A critical rehabilitation studies lens aims to uncover or unpack ideas and concepts that have become dominant and taken for granted in rehabilitation practice, such as the high value placed on independence, values around participation, and why some of these have become the so-called right way to think in rehabilitation. So in short, critical rehabilitation studies is a new field that asks how socially ingrained notions, assumptions, values, and beliefs are reflected in rehabilitation practice. What do we do and think about disability has a lot to do with how we then act on disability. How is it that we come to understand disability and its links with the capacity to live a good life? To ask those questions then involves acknowledgement and acceptance of other ways of seeing and understanding the world. Importantly, like all critical work, critical rehabilitation studies investigates the taken for granted by attending to power, critiquing the dominance of positivism, calling out ableism in rehabilitation practice, and calling for leadership by and partnerships with disabled persons. Critical rehabilitation studies asks the important question, inspired by critical theorist Michel Foucault: what does what we do do? In other words, what are the effects of the things we do as pain researchers or clinicians? Before concluding, I really want to pay a bit of attention to the critical perspectives that would not be complete without considering how we as researchers can leverage our relative positions of power to foreground the priorities, views, and preferences of people living with pain. What is at stake as we endeavor to find ethical terms of engagement for these partnerships? Again, critical social science perspectives can help us here. Some wonderful work has been done by Dr. Paula Rowland, who's right here at University of Toronto. She points out that given the time, commitment, and generosity involved in patient engagement efforts in organizations, we suggest that there is a deep ethical obligation to give these programs such careful thought, questioning again, what are the terms of engagement in terms of what we talk about as citizen or patient or knowledge user engagement? Again, one of my favorite quotes, pointing out every way of knowing contains its own moral trajectory. So as we ask people to spend time working together, partnering, all of these words that we use, trying to think about the relationship that we have with engaged folks, what are the ethics that underpin those relationships? Again, also at U of T, although I think she may now be at University of Guelph, Dr. Veronka has warned passionately about the politics of commodifying lived experience and the potential moral harms associated with engaging in partner engagement activities. Again, she's not against, but she's asking us to bring our critical eye forward. Negotiating the authority of lived experience within collaborative research is a difficult, exhausting, and complicated exchange, and often results in only small inroads. My body, representing inclusion, diversity, and difference at the table, further legitimizes such research projects as inclusionary, diversified, and participatory. So she speaks on behalf of patient partners as she cautions, as we work to privilege lived experience as a commodity that can translate into inclusion within the folds of power, we also have to think through our own agency, complicity, conflicts, and productivity. In an even shorter way, I would suggest we have to think about who is gaining, whose views are made to matter, whose views are consequential when it comes to these kinds of relationships. So I haven't presented today at all about the results of some of the research that I do, but I do want to just mention that by bringing these three and other critical perspectives into my research, tremendous value is added. For example, by continually pointing out the ways that pain, disability, and impairment are often conflated to the extent that everyday pain may be taken for granted as an inevitable consequence of living with impairment and disability, which clearly risks pain being overlooked by clinicians, researchers, and also by disabled children and youth themselves. By explicitly adopting critical perspectives, the research in my lab highlights tensions around how pain is understood across fields and the ways those tensions contribute to very real-world material effects for disabled children and youth. And thank you. Look forward to the next speakers.
A big thanks for the invitation to come and talk with you today. And as my colleague Dr. Teachman said, I mean, we're clearly not going to solve any problems here, but hopefully if I do this right over the next 10 minutes, we'll create enough questions and perhaps cause enough turbulence to engage in some fruitful conversation afterwards. So you can see my title here, and the idea of knowing the pain of another person, this idea of knowing actually has come up a few times through some of the presentations already this morning. And so hopefully this resonates with the group. And how can we know? What can we know? And you'll see I've put a little subtitle there of aspiring transdisciplinarian. So I know the topic of our panel is meant to be around this idea of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary work in the clinic. And so I'll intentionally just leave that thread dangling here for a moment. I'm just going to try and maybe set a different approach to the stage here, to the conversation. So as you just heard, I'm with the School of Physical Therapy, so I had a 10-year career as a physical therapist, and then got into my academic role 15 years ago. Now, since that time, I guess I've done all right. Elsevier and Stanford database has me listed amongst the top 2% of researchers in my field, as I know, in fact, others here are also on that list. By other metrics, I'm apparently the 3rd or 4th ranked expert in neck pain in the world, whatever that means. If you query Web of Science the right way, apparently I'm the 1st ranked pain assessment and evaluation researcher in Canadian rehab research right now. And I say all that not to inflate my clearly already overly inflated ego, but rather to say that I stand here before you today very much with the real imposter syndrome and a real sense of humility in that much of what has happened in my career over the past 6 or 7 years, including engagements and interactions with some of my colleagues, has very much led me to a point where I'm at today, which is now starting to interrogate and question much of my own work that I've done in the past. I am, as you heard, I kind of grew up academically as a measurement scientist, and certainly had you talked to me 10 years ago, I would have said, well, we can measure anything if you just ask the questions the right way. And I'll explain a couple of things that have triggered a bit of a shift in that thinking, and then hopefully we'll get into some conversation here going forward. So when I talk about measurement, I do spend a lot of time trying to understand pain, trying to know pain, and I thought maybe a good place to set a stage to start with would be the current Canadian opioid prescribing guideline. I'm sure you can read all of that. This is intentionally broad. If you can go and seek this out on Google if you really want to, and you'll see that there are 10 recommendations there for opioid prescription, and you'll note the date there, 2017, so this came out right around the height of the sort of global panic around the opioid pandemic and epidemic. And what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to grab the very first recommendation. And so the very first recommendation says, when considering therapy for patients with chronic non-cancer pain, we recommend optimization of non-opioid pharmacotherapy and non-pharmacological therapy rather than a trial of opioids. And this comes as a strong recommendation. So this is recommendation number 1 for the current opioid prescribing guidelines here in Canada, and this is very similar to that in the US. As I tend to do, I went in to see what is the research that informed these guidelines. And there were 21 papers listed that informed that particular recommendation. I was able to find 17 of them. The other 4 were all in non-English language journals that I couldn't track down. You'll note that 15 of those 17, the primary outcome is a number from 0 to 10, sometimes a line from 0 to 100 millimeters. And in the other 2, it was embedded within the primary outcome. So where I say, how do we know the pain of another person, I find it interesting that we have, I say we, I'm going to use the royal we, the pain field writ large seems to have sort of accepted this 0 to 10 numeric rating scale as the de facto way of knowing the pain of another person. I, having been in the measurement field for some time, have become increasingly aware of the power of measurement. And as soon as we start to assign numbers to things and those things become targets, Goodhart's law says that these are no longer measures. So if as researchers, I'm going to say the word we, with the field that I've been involved with for many years, have said to clinicians and to policymakers that the best outcome you can possibly achieve in pain management is 0 out of 10. You know the best way to get somebody to feel absolutely nothing? Prescribe, right? And that's where it stops. And you might think that seems overly simplistic. No, it's not. This is how we have formed what we all collectively call pain evidence. And knowledge about pain is a 0 to 10 scale. In fact, so ubiquitous has this become that the impact group, arguably one of the most influential groups in terms of pain research design globally, has said that the velvet rope by which a patient or a person has to pass in order to enter a pain research study is that they rate their pain at a 4 to 10 or higher. If they don't get into the studies. And yet we know that there's many people that would rate their pain lower than 4 out of 10. Equally, we know that 4 out of 10 is effectively meaningless, other than 4 is bigger than 3 and smaller than 5. It's about the extent of it. My 4 is different than your 4 is different than yours, right? So what we've ended up with here is a tool that has become disproportionately powerful in my mind, in that this is how we've come to create knowledge. This is, in fact, even how we've come to allow people to enter our projects. This tool is what determines whether somebody receives an opioid or not. As medical assistance in dying becomes more widely accepted for people with chronic pain, I'm reasonably confident this tool will be included in part of the decision about whether or not somebody is able to access MAID. How we've gotten to this point, then, blows me away. And this is where now I start to challenge much of my own work. And so, as you're not, no, this will surprise no one, that the way patients select that number is not some accurate representation of where they actually sit on this latent construct of pain that none of us can in fact observe, but many of us in the post-positivist world have to believe exists, and a person gives us a number that accurately represents the severity or the intensity of that experience, wherever they lay on that continuum. But as, again, this will surprise no one to know that of course is inaccurate. I would bet dollars to donuts if any of you were to go right now and pick up the first clinical trial on pain that you could find on PubMed, go to Table 1, you'll see the mean pain rating score on people on entry into that study is somewhere between 4 and 6 out of 10 and a standard deviation of about 2. And I say that because I've reviewed hundreds of such papers. Hold on. And that seems to be the consistent case. So what I pulled here was just an example of how patients decide what number they're going to assign to their pain. And very little of it is related to the actual severity or intensity of the experience. We're here talking about social science today. You can see the entire sort of second half of that, the right side of that scale really has very much to do with how they think the person who's asking the question will receive their response and will respond to them and will validate them. Equally, despite being far and away the most commonly used pain measure in the world, we don't even know how to answer it or how to deliver it consistently. It's interesting to me, in fact, again, frustrating in some ways, that I think we widely accept what zero means. We'll say zero means, let's say it's no pain. And we can stop and we can spend some time thinking about what does that exactly mean. But what's the opposite of zero? What's the opposite of nothing? And you can see here there's all sorts of different anchors that have been used. And so once again, we have this tool that is easily the most widely used pain measurement tool. In fact, it's one of the most widely used outcome measures in the world. And somehow, there's very little consensus on even how we implement it, interpret it. As I mentioned, I'm no stranger to the field. I've definitely done quite a bit of work in this field. I have done some challenge in the field as well. I've started to question some of these taken for granted assumptions about these measures and how we know the pain of another person. But what I hope we'll do here today is talk about otherwise ways of accomplishing these. I mentioned that my career sort of took a bit of a shift, and I just thought germane to just raise this quickly, that in 2017 I took a sabbatical, and at that time I was 7 years outside of my clinical practice, and realizing that for every minute I sit in my little office in the ivory tower of Western University is a minute more removed I get from the realities of frontline practice. And I felt it was wise, if I'm going to call myself a clinical researcher, that I should get back out there and understand what's happening on the ground, so to speak. So I created the Physio Moves Canada project. And that project, I spent 3 months. I flew out to Newfoundland, took my family with me, and for 3 months we drove all the way clear across Canada to end up in Whitehorse, and stopped as many clinics, hospitals, community centers as I could along the way, spoke with clinicians, spoke with their patients, and really tried to understand what it means to be in pain, what it means to feel disabled, importantly in my mind, what it meant to feel recovered, which is something that I also spent a lot of time thinking about. The point of this is the information I heard during that, the emotion with which people talked to me about their experiences of pain and recovery forced me to start questioning and challenging everything I thought I knew about doing pain research, and I think that's partly what has brought me here today. And certainly my interactions with Dr. Teachman have been instrumental in helping me to sort of reshape my thinking about this. So despite perhaps what might be considered academic success, I would say I very much feel as though I know very little about this field. So I'll just leave you with this. So perhaps maybe where we need to go is we need to start to build the transdisciplinary researcher, and whatever that looks like. I'm going to pose a question of whether that's truly possible. Can we as researchers talk across fields in meaningful ways? You'll see a definition of transdisciplinarity there. Is that about researchers who can do everything but are perhaps masters of none? Is that about researchers who know how to at least talk across boundaries and barriers and engage with lived experience partners and know how to respect the knowledge of everyone? And I think that's a good conversation for us to have. I'll just show you that I have tried. So much of my work has been in clinical pain research. I have done work in the basic sciences, and most recently I have done work in the critical social sciences. So I have come to this late in my career, and I'm very actively trying to learn more now. So I'm going to leave you with this. I know there's a better way for us to know the pain of another person. Don't know what it is. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. I think it's an honor to be here with all the amazing critical pain scholars and have this amazing discussion so far. So hopefully I can contribute to that a little bit. So what I think of just sharing was a couple of ideas in this 10-minute, 12-minute talk of what I've learned or what I think interdisciplinary can be in terms of bringing the social science concepts to the clinic. I just would like to first make an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianships of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. I think as many of you here, I'm a physiotherapist by background who used social science, philosophical concepts into my PhD. So I really consider myself being between two worlds. Not sure how well am I in these two worlds actually, but has been actually fascinating as a physio, a healthcare practitioner, to learn other lenses and learn from social science and theory. So the things that I will be presenting here today is mainly from this output, but I will also bring some thoughts from other research that I've done, some other papers as well. But this will be perhaps the main one, if you are interested. So my PhD, actually, the main aim was to critically explore how low back pain care was enacted or was done in practice, and what factors beyond that model could be attended to in clinical practice. And just as a spoiler, these are all the factors that actually the biopsychosocial model doesn't kind of approach, such as interpersonal, institutional power dynamics, social stigma, individual social context, healthcare services, workplace culture, social justice, and so forth. So fundamentally, theoretically, the biopsychosocial model doesn't actually attend to those aspects. And what I thought of bringing here today in terms of how bringing the social science concepts into the clinic looked like was actually through the relational methods that I had the chance to using in my PhD. So the methods that I used was I did some ethnographic observations of clinical practices. So I observed, took notes of clinicians and patients with low back pain, team meetings as well. So clinicians, what they talk, the environment, what is portrayed in clinics. There were 2 clinics, a physiotherapy clinic in Australia and a pain multidisciplinary pain clinic with lots of different clinicians as well. So ethnographic observations as one method. Another method, which I'll talk more about, is the critically reflexive dialogues that we had with clinicians from those clinics. And these critically reflexive dialogues, we actually brought some ideas of what we were observing to the clinicians to actually discuss our findings and see what their thoughts were on those observations. And that was considered our analysis as well. It was part of our analysis, bringing their understanding of our own findings or our own data per se. And we also had discussions and consultations with people with lived experience of low back pain to also have their thoughts and their experience on their own, of course, experience, but also, on our data as well and the clinicians' dialogue. So that's why I mentioned it is quite a relational method. Like was very iterative, the analysis, the data collection, the data analysis, whatever sometimes that is. So it was very about relationships between people and what we were finding in the data. So as I mentioned, I'm focusing on the critically reflexive dialogues. And in terms of transparency, this type of method was actually used here by Professor Barbara Gibson in another kind of project here in Canada. And what are those? They are facilitated group exchanges between researchers and clinicians to challenge clinicians' usual ways of working by destabilizing assumptions, perspectives, and ways of being and acting on the world. So by bringing what we observed in the clinical interaction between clinicians, we kind of challenged their assumptions as well in those dialogues, what we call. From those critically reflexive dialogues, I think that we also kind of brought some social science concepts to the clinicians, which was quite interesting to hear their thoughts on how that actually plays a role in their practice. But what were the key findings, at least for me, about talking about social science with the clinicians, having this very challenging clinicians' assumptions, was having difficult conversations and starting to have difficult conversations in the clinic. One clinician actually said, there isn't really a formal mechanism in the department beyond your study that I can think of, at least, where we can actually sit back and have a conversation around systems issues. Lots and lots of time to talk about individual patient care, but nothing really to reflect on the deep end. So that was quite interesting coming from them, because they have like this very settled, team meetings where they talked about complex case studies, but only between clinicians and patients, not about the systemic issues that are around that interaction, that plays a role in that interaction. Another thing as well from this, critically reflexive dialogues is that clinicians started to reconsider power dynamics within a multidisciplinary team. And one example is one of the clinicians mentioned that they've been building on this idea of complex case discussions. And with that, I think comes the acknowledgement, even for the senior staff, that often we really don't know what to do. That's very common in pain management. And to normalize that so that particularly the junior staff, when they see that, they presumably feel less distressed by not knowing what to do either. So it's not only about the power dynamics between clinicians and patients, but between clinicians as well, to kind of, look, we don't really know what to do. And this was a doctor within, it's a very complex as well, power dynamics within allied health and doctors. So that was quite interesting as well, how they reflected on their own assumptions. And this was a little bit more complicated because although we brought we challenged their assumptions about access to healthcare, it was a little bit complicated because this was from one of participants. They mentioned sometimes it's actually better to take the easy patients, the quick patients, and troll through all of those, knowing that the really severe patients, actually our changes of getting an improvement are very low. And we actually challenged the assumption of what are easy patients? What do you consider easy patients? And usually what they consider easy and complex is actually very inequitable. And we actually challenged that, and we kind of had that difficult conversation, and they actually made them rethink a little bit on that, but it was very hard. It was very challenging because if you think about healthcare, at least in Australia, how pain management programs are evaluated, they evaluate by quick, coming in, coming out, discharge. So all of those things, it was very complex to them, which is very inequitable as well. So that was quite challenging. Although made them rethink, it was not completely done yet. So that was quite interesting. So I thought of bringing these three main ones, but also some lessons learned from that experience with, clinicians, and bringing this more reflexive thought into the clinic was the challenges, that these competing priorities of how we kind of tried to kind of challenge those assumptions, but because institutional practices are set up the way that they do, it's really hard for clinicians to kind of break that down. And it's unfortunately because then they are the ones that can also change some of those the ways that those what to assess, what to not assess, and how to actually decide who gets to access the programs as well. Changes in leadership and staff was a constant challenge because when we had a very good group, then somebody new came in, and then we had to kind of discuss that again and again. The important role of the facilitator, so having that critical understanding and a very challenging clinicians in a very respectful way and understanding way, but also challenging, still challenging. Making sociological thinking and concepts relatable. As a physiotherapist, it was quite hard to understand sometimes social science concepts, and then bringing that to them, we try to make it as relatable as possible as well. And some opportunities engaging with what was important to clinicians and people with lived experience of low back pain. So once we also brought to the clinic what patients were asking and what was really important to them, that made clinicians feel, oh, okay, so perhaps we actually need to think about that. So that importance of that relationality between clinicians, researchers, and patients with the experts with lived experience. And that comes with the trusting in reciprocal relationship. The methods were really interesting because there was a lot of relationality into that, because my supervisor used to work in one of the clinic, had a contact with another clinic. So that kind of personal relationship is quite important as well within those, to have those difficult conversations, I'm assuming. And then you have the leadership as well, trusting the process and trusting the research. The importance of flexibility. So bringing important concepts and understandings from the clinicians and from people with lived experience as well, not only what researchers, what we want to discuss, but what they want to discuss and what they bring to the table. And bringing is challenges and opportunities, bringing sociological thinking and concepts to practice as well. So sorry if that was rushed, but thank you so much and looking forward to the discussions. Yeah.